Hey everyone, Kalablade here again for another installment of KalaVlogs. Now in light of the Halloween season, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about some of my favorite horror movies and recommend some of them to you. Now this isn't exactly like a top 10 or whatever, it's more just me going through some horror movies I'd like to talk about and recommend, which is exactly what I said before. So let's waste no more time and get started. Now I want to first recommend my all-time favorite horror movie ever, and that is The Evil Dead, directed by Sam Raimi. This is inferior to its sequel, Evil Dead 2, in most respects. Most people will agree. But Evil Dead 2 is much more of a horror comedy, or at least it has a lot of elements of comedy in it. The director, Sam Raimi, is a big fan of slapstick and Three Stooges, and it definitely shows in Evil Dead 2. But the first one here, hidden inside the Book of the Dead, which is one of my favorite movie cases ever, is hands down my favorite straight-up horror movie. And it is a straight-up horror movie. A lot of people are under the misconception because of movies like Evil Dead 2 and the third movie in the series, Army of Darkness, that they're supposed to be all funny. Now, the first Evil Dead movie was not intended to be a comedy at all, and some people forget that, which actually was, I think, detrimental to the remake that came out a few years back of The Evil Dead, which, first of all, did not star Bruce Campbell as the character Ash, which was a major turnoff for some people already. But it's a straight-up horror movie. It's very gruesome, not for the faint of heart, and I know some people went in expecting the comedy that Evil Dead has sort of become famous for, especially with, people who watch it nowadays, a few years later with the new Evil Dead TV show on Starz, which is very much in the vein of Army of Darkness and Evil Dead 2. It's very funny, and I do recommend that as well. But if I had to choose my all-time favorite horror movie, I would definitely choose Evil Dead, the original 1981 version. Absolutely. It is I wouldn't call it a masterpiece, but it's proof what can be done on a little budget. They didn't have a very big budget when they made it, and it actually took them years and years to actually finish the thing. So with what they had to work with, it definitely is impressive. There's actually a great book called The Evil Dead Companion, I think, which chronicles the director Sam Raimi's early footsteps in his film career and goes into great detail about the making of The Evil Dead. So I recommend that if you're a horror buff or want to know more about The Evil Dead. So moving on is another horror classic from 1984, I think. A movie I'm not a fan of at all is Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, a lot of the movies I'm about to show you guys are probably going to come as no surprise, especially people who know me well. But this one I actually saw when I was pretty young. Not as young as some people saw it, but I knew who Freddy Krueger was by the time I was 3 years old. There's a line in one of the many, many sequels later, sort of sequels, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, where they say, every kid knows who Freddy is. He's like Santa Claus. Now, I'd like to think that Santa Claus isn't going to try and kill me when I sleep, but I get what they mean, especially if you grew up in the 80s or even the early 90s, which is when I was first learning about Freddy. I knew who he was. I knew all about him. I knew what how he would haunt you in your nightmares, all that stuff, years and years before I actually saw any of the movies at all. Although my older brother, who is probably the main reason I'm into as many of these horror movies as I am. Well, actually, both of my older brothers love horror movies, so it's kind of carried on. He showed me a scene from Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5 when I was really little, and it wasn't even a gruesome part or even a scary part, really. It's just, it's the part where Freddy goes, "It's a boy!" And that gave me nightmares. So, I was a easily frightened child back then. I've come a long way. I'm not easily frightened anymore. So, moving on, we have splatter film, which is what I would actually lump the first Evil Dead into, where yes, it's a horror movie, but it's got an overemphasis on gore and gross-out effects. And this movie held the distinction for a long time. I believe it has been beaten, actually, by the Evil Dead remake. But it held the distinction for a long time of being the bloodiest movie ever made in terms of literally how much blood they actually used. Fake blood, obviously, but gallons and gallons. I can't remember the exact figure, it might even say on the case, because it was quite a bragging right for a long time, is Peter Jackson's Dead Alive, or as it was known internationally in New Zealand where it was made, Brain Dead. Now this is a fun movie. Not a serious movie, it's very much a tongue-in-cheek comedy horror movie, but very gory, very gross, very gross, very fun though. And this is where Peter Jackson really got his start before doing things like Lord of the Rings. He started with horror. And this wasn't his first horror movie he did. His first horror movie was called Bad Taste, which was about aliens trying to start a fast food chain on Earth using human meat for their food. But what Dead Alive is about is a Sumatran rat monkey ends up biting someone and spreading a disease which turns them into zombies, including a little zombie baby, which two zombies get it on and conceive. And there is one of the funniest scenes, I think, in horror movie history that I've seen, where the main hero, who's trying to maintain sort of a normal life and keep the fact that he's got all of these zombies in his basement it's just getting out of control, he takes the zombie baby to the park in a stroller, and hilarity ensues. So, and a lot of these movies I could probably talk about for even longer. Some of them I probably will go off on tangents, as I am wont to do. But let's keep moving on. But Dead Alive, I recommend it if you want something that will disgust you and have you rolling on the floor laughing all at the same time. Now, with the popularity of things like The Walking Dead nowadays, it's huge, it's everywhere, spoilers all over the internet. I'm actually way behind on that show. Almost a couple of seasons, so it's kind of my own damn fault. But recently they killed off a major character, and I don't even think anybody gave two shits about trying to keep it a secret. So I know what happens. And that kind of sucks, but at least, it's not Game of Thrones. Now, if I get Game of Thrones spoiled, I get really angry. But where was I? So yeah, the zombie boom, it's still really big because of things like Walking Dead. I feel like it's kind of winding down a little bit. For a while there, it was everywhere. But we wouldn't have any of that were it not for one movie. And it is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and I think a timeless classic. And that is George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Now, this is actually the first zombie movie I ever saw, and is single-handedly responsible for the creation of the rating system, because back when this came out in 1968, we didn't have ratings for movies yet, but that followed very shortly after this, because this came out at a time when, kids would go and see these scary movies in theaters, just like any other scary movie, like the 30s and 40s ones, which we'll be moving on to in just a little bit. But they had no idea what they were in for when they saw this. And for that matter, neither did I really. I was only 8 years old when I saw Night of the Living Dead. And I remember my mom wasn't all that thrilled about it, but for whatever reason we actually talked her into letting me watch it. And it didn't give me nightmares or anything, but it definitely scared me. Absolutely. I think even today, as far as a lot of the zombie movies go, it's pretty damn scary. And I think that's just a testament to the craft of the film and how they were able to make it. The makeup wasn't that elaborate or anything. It was just how it was all executed. And it also broke a lot of ground in terms of having a black leading protagonist, which was kind of unheard of back then. It's just one of the many reasons why this movie was progressive. And it was really ballsy with the ending, which I won't spoil for those of you who haven't seen it. But just a great movie, and we owe the zombie franchises that exist today to that one movie. Absolutely. I highly recommend Night of the Living Dead. Now we're going to go back in time a little bit to the silent era. Now this is a movie that I think has held up remarkably well. And I know a lot of people. I actually have a friend who, I won't name names, but they refuse to watch old movies, black and white movies especially. They know who they are. They're a big fan of Peter Jackson's King Kong remake, for example, and I suggested they check out the 1933 original, and they're like, well, I don't really like watching movies that came out before 2000, and I told them they're absolutely crazy, because, we wouldn't have the movies we have today were it not for these landmark films of yesteryear. And I know I sound like a major, I run the risk of sounding like a pretentious film nerd when I say that, which I kind of am sometimes. But, yeah. Nosferatu. This is the first surviving film adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. I believe there was one other that came between Nosferatu and the more famous one with Bela Lugosi, which we'll get to in a minute. But this one definitely has endured. The interesting thing about this movie is, while it is an adaptation of Dracula, the vampire in it is known as Count Orlok, and all of the other names and places have been altered because F.W. Murnau, the director of this movie, couldn't secure the rights to adapt Dracula. Bram Stoker's widow actually got very angry with them for making this movie as it is. So he just renamed a few things, but it's Dracula. But the depiction of the vampire in this one, which a lot of people just call Nosferatu, even though his name is Orlok, is still quite frightening. And the use of shadows and lighting in that movie is masterful. It's part of the era of film called German Expressionism, and it's one of my favorite looks in a movie, visual styles. Some other good ones are Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is a very trippy looking kind of movie, and actually a lot of Tim Burton's visual style, one could say, actually came from things like that, German Expressionism. So, Nosferatu, I think it's still scary today if you're in the right mindset. You know, horror movies from back then were much slower, they weren't gory, it was a very different feel watching them. So it's more about atmosphere, I would say, than, you know, shock value and thrills. But if you can put yourself in the right mindset, they're great movies to have on, even in the background during the Halloween season. Now, the next few I'm going to try and just kind of whip through quickly because there are so many, and it's something I'm really passionate about and really I've been in a big phase for these movies this month, and they've sort of been what I've been watching all through October is the classic Universal monster films. So we got a stack here of them. I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly here. There's the original, classic, timeless, flawed, yes, but still very entertaining, Dracula, directed by Todd Browning, starring the immortal Bela Lugosi. It's not the best of the Universal horror lineup, but it was the first, so I think it kind of is acceptable, some of its shortcomings, because at the time they were still trying to, I think, sort of perfect their formula. Now, it's not technically the first. There were others in the silent era before that, like the Phantom of the Opera movie with Lon Chaney Sr., The Man of a Thousand Faces. There was, he also did a silent version of Hunchback of Notre Dame. But Dracula was the first talkie, was the first one with sound. So it's a landmark film in that respect. And we also have Frankenstein with Boris Karloff, directed by James Whale, who I think might be the most talented director of the Universal monster films over the course of its whole lineup in the 30s and 40s. And I know I'm not alone in that opinion. This one, I would say, is actually a superior movie to the Lugosi Dracula in most respects in terms of how it was shot, acting, direction, you name it. It's technically a superior movie. Which one is my favorite? It's really hard for me to choose amongst all of these Universal horror films. But we'll get to that in a moment. I think it depends on the mood I'm in. I'm really biased toward Dracula. As a little kid, he was my favorite. And I actually got introduced to these characters from one of the last movies that Universal ever did in their monster series, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which if you follow me on the Kalablade the Geek Facebook page, you would have seen my post earlier this month about that. And if you don't follow me on that page, please do, because I know I've had a lot of inactivity on the site lately. I haven't been getting a lot of videos up, and there's been a laundry list of reasons as to why I haven't. There's been a lot of stuff going on, as I said, way back in my old update vlog, and that's sort of the same thing that's been continuing on. So, yeah, if I'm not very active in getting videos up, sort of as an apology, I will occasionally put posts up on the Facebook page, movie recommendations and whatnot. So that is still a way to reach me, since I just haven't been on YouTube as much as I want to be, or as I should be, although I'm hoping that'll change soon. But I'm going off on a tangent. Moving on, we have the Boris Karloff Mummy. Now, this one I talked about a little bit in my review of the 1999 remake. It's not my favorite of the Universal horror movies. I think it's one of the slower ones. But in terms of atmosphere, it's fantastic. And Karloff plays an interesting character in this, in that, it's sort of like in Frankenstein, he's not a total monster, he's not a total villain, like Lugosi was as Dracula. In this, it's still a love story where he's trying to bring back, the love of his life, Anxunamun. And that story was retold in the 99 version, and is in this one as well, and sort of adds a bit of a sympathetic edge to him. He's definitely less evil of a mummy, I would say, than the version they depicted in the 99 one. I mean, he's still bad, he still kills people, it's a horror film. But, it's quite good. And the makeup in this one, I think, when he's actually in the mummy form here, before he, regenerates and looks like that, is some of the best makeup in these Universal movies, probably. Jack Pierce was the name of the makeup artist who did all of these Universal horror films. And, what Karloff had to go through to put that makeup on is just totally intense. I mean, he was really hardcore, because what the stuff they would use on his face, I think it was called collodium. I've been watching a lot of documentaries about this stuff, as you can tell. Had ether in it. I mean, it burned, and it took him, I want to say, 6 hours just to put on the mummy makeup. And sometimes he would sleep in his makeup as the mummy or the Frankenstein monster, just because taking it off, from what I understand, was even more painful than putting it on, and he just did not want to go through with that. I can't blame the poor guy. So he was a real trooper, and I think that's also a testament to how devoted he was to his craft. I also have here, it's all the Frankenstein lineup that Universal did, and that has Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein on it, which is one of the main reasons I actually really wanted this, because, as I said earlier, that was my introduction to Universal horror, and it was near the end of the lineup, and it was, I think they were injecting comedy in it to sort of reinvigorate it, because it was sort of starting to fizzle out in the late 40s, and also at that time Abbott and Costello were hugely popular. In fact, they were some of the most highest paid actors in the business at the time. And last but not least, in the Universal collection that I currently have, we have The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. And while it's tough for me to pick an absolute favorite in these movies, I would say that The Wolfman is, in terms of screenwriting, acting, and all of that, definitely superior. Which kind of makes sense, because it came in the early 1940s. It started off the second wave of these monster films, with the first wave starting in the early 30s. And Lon Chaney Jr., I think, is part of the reason it's so good. He brings a lot of charisma to his role as the main character, Lawrence Talbot. So you actually feel really bad for him and what he goes through in this movie. But it's, I would say, definitely a masterpiece. I mean, one could argue all of these are. I debate with my wife about some of them, because some of them are far from perfect, some of them are really corny. But I love all of that. I love the whole feel and look of the Universal monster films, and have since I was a little kid. Really quick, back on Abbott and Costello, the first one I tried to watch it when I was 3. My dad showed it to me, and it gave me nightmares, so we didn't finish it. It started to scare me, and apparently it was the Frankenstein monster that had me so terrified, which nowadays I find kind of funny, because now I see him as, a sympathetic character. But for whatever reason back then, it was the Frankenstein monster that had me scared. I thought he was under my bed and that he was going to get me, and my sister even wrote a poem about it, which you should still turn into a children's book. It was really good. But yeah, Dracula never scared me. As a kid, I always wanted to be Dracula. I know, how goth of me, right? But I always thought he was cool. And I gave the movie another go when I was about 6, and that's when I really fell in love with Universal horror, and I was actually Dracula for Halloween that year, too. But yeah, to summarize, I love all of these movies. I think my favorite might actually be Frankenstein, or its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, but it's a tough call. But I will admit that I think Wolfman is the best written and the best acted, so... Now, speaking of Wolfman, in 2010, they came out with a remake, which was critically panned. And honestly, my personal opinion, I think it is grossly underrated. And that's the 2010 remake of The Wolfman, starring Benicio del Toro as Lawrence Talbot. And he may not have the same charisma or likability as Lon Chaney Jr.'s portrayal of Talbot, but this movie is just an absolute love letter to Universal horror, albeit a much more violent and gruesome one. It's, R-rated, except there is an unrated version, which actually I think is better. But the point I'm trying to make is I feel like it was misunderstood. I've heard all sorts of complaints about it. It's too slow, or it's not scary enough. I feel like the pacing and the tone, although quite a bit darker than what they could have gotten away with in the early 40s, is still very reverential. Kind of like Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong, where it's obvious the people who made it just love the hell out of the original movie, and I think it shows through every frame of the film. Another complaint people had about the remake was that there was too much CGI, and there is a bit of CGI. It's not a CGI fest like Stephen Sommers' monster movies, like The Mummy, Van Helsing, which we might talk about in a little bit. But totally overlooked is just how good the practical effects in this movie are. The makeup was done by a famous makeup artist, Rick Baker, who also did the werewolf effects for American Werewolf in London, which is another great, great movie. And I think that the werewolf effects in the Wolfman remake are top-notch, and the movie should be watched, in my opinion, just for the werewolf effects alone. I mean, it is a monster movie. It's not a typical horror movie either, which in 2010 might have been a turnoff to some people who didn't know what they were in for. Yeah, I don't, it's a horror movie, yes, but no, it's a monster movie, which depending on how you look at it, there is a distinction between the two. It's a full-on monster movie. It's nothing super special, but I think it's everything it needed to be. And I really think that more people should give it a chance, and that critics are a little too mean to this one, honestly. I think it was really well done. The atmosphere is spot on. The music by Danny Elfman is some of the best I think he's ever actually composed. It doesn't even really sound like your typical Danny Elfman score. In fact, it makes me think more of the score to the Dracula film from the early 90s, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now that soundtrack is also a masterpiece, which both of these soundtracks will be mentioned if I ever actually get around to making that damn top 10 movie score video I've been talking about forever and ever. But yeah, check out the Wolfman remake, especially if you're a fan of the original and just want to see an updated version. And I think if you're a bigger fan of the original, as long as you're not too picky, you'll see that it's really just a love letter to the monster films of the 40s, especially. So, speaking of love letters to monster films from the 30s and 40s, we're going to go into comedy territory here for a minute. And this is the movie I mentioned on that Facebook post about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein that I used to watch right after. I would watch these two movies back to back every Halloween. And that is Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein, starring the late, great Gene Wilder. A masterpiece in comedy, quite possibly, in my opinion, one of the funniest movies ever made, if not the funniest movie ever made. If I were to do a top 10 favorite comedies, this would probably be number one, right in front of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but that's also debatable. But yeah, Young Frankenstein is a spoof of the 1930s and 40s Frankenstein movies, specifically the movie Son of Frankenstein, which this movie makes a lot of references and callbacks to. But yeah, I love, love, love Young Frankenstein, and no matter how many times I watch it, I will always laugh at the same jokes over and over again. It never gets old or feels like, it runs stale or anything like that. It is just as good every time I watch it. I can never get tired of this movie. And I grew up with this one as well, and it's probably one that my family quotes very regularly, all of us. It's a very quotable comedy film, very much like Monty Python that I mentioned. But yeah, out of all the Mel Brooks movies, this one is the number one Mel Brooks comedy. Most people agree, I think. There are some who might like Blazing Saddles more, but unlike a lot of the Mel Brooks movies, the Gene Wilder, he actually co-wrote the script to this and injected his own humor sensibilities into it, which I think makes it feel, no offense to Mr. Brooks, a little more of a sophisticated film. I think you can kind of tell which humor is Mel Brooks's humor and which humor is Gene Wilder's humor, although they mesh together very well. Yeah, I couldn't sing its praises enough. It's a wonderful film. We talked about the Universal horror films a little bit, the monster movies of the 30s and 40s. In the late 1950s, England came out with their own series of monster films. It was sort of like, they were considered remakes at the time, but they're so different that I think of them kind of as their own entities. But it all started in the late 50s with the Hammer horror films, and the one I want to talk about specifically is 1958's Horror of Dracula, starring Christopher Lee. A lot of people are aware of this, even if they haven't seen it, that Christopher Lee played Dracula, and he actually did it for years and years, which is contrary to the common misconception that Bela Lugosi here played Dracula tons and tons of times. He actually only did it twice, in Dracula, and then in Bela Lugosi, in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Bela Lugosi did meet Frankenstein in that movie, though. But out of all of the Christopher Lee Dracula movies, Horror of Dracula, or Dracula it was called in the UK, they renamed it Horror of Dracula here in the States because they were worried people would confuse it for the Lugosi movie, which I think is kind of silly, honestly. But out of all the Dracula movies Christopher Lee did, it's the only one that I would honestly say is a good movie. The others are very, very, very cheesy at times, and they get super contrived the way they keep bringing Dracula back over and over again, which sounds really familiar. If you think about the slasher series of today, and, you know, the 80s and 70s, mainly 80s. So if you watch these, you can kind of see where that all started. The Hammer movies, they have their own charm to them. It was the first time these monsters were really seen in color, for example, so there was lots of blood. It was a new thing. They were very risque and kind of controversial when they came out because of things like blood, which is like scarlet red. It almost looks like bright red paint, which is it's just fantastic. You know, it looks so fake, but it looks so good, if that makes sense. The art direction, the set design in Horror of Dracula is really, really, really good. It's got a very gothic atmosphere about the whole thing, and was a very good update to what Universal did. But yeah, quite controversial when they came out because, you know, blood and cleavage too, so, you know, scandalous. But if you want a good time, I would even recommend the sequels, that they did after the first Dracula movie, but they do start to get pretty bad. There was even one of the sequels, Christopher Lee thought the writing of his dialogue was so awful that he refused to say any of his lines, which is why these movies are famous for Christopher Lee's Dracula not really saying much, being a man of very few words. Speaking of Hammer horror, we have one that I like to watch this time of year. It's Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow. Now, this movie is a total love letter to the Hammer horror films. It's got a few homages to the Universal monster films as well, like the windmill in this movie is a direct callback to the windmill at the end of the original Frankenstein film. But the tone, the look, the humor, and the overabundance of bright red blood, I mean, we're talking blood as red as the logo here, is everywhere in this movie. And if you realize that this movie is a great big homage to the Hammer movies, I think it makes it even easier to appreciate it, because I've known people who have adored Sleepy Hollow, and I've known people who have thought it was kind of dumb, you know, it was a bit weird, you know, why is it a horror movie, but there's also all of this goofy humor, a lot of this cheesy overacting in this movie. it's all there on purpose. It's all deliberate to be very much in the spirit of these Hammer films. Absolutely. I've tried to keep my rambling actually to a minimum. I could talk about these movies for a lot longer than I am. And there's a ton that I left out just for time's sake. And a lot of movies I wanted to talk about that I don't actually own. Some I was surprised to find out I don't own, because between me and my wife, our DVD collection's gotten quite big. So I could have sworn, for example, that I owned John Carpenter's classic Halloween, which, when I realized I didn't own it, I couldn't believe it. I thought we had it, but we don't. So, and speaking of Halloween, which kind of kicked off the slasher boom of the 80s, although it came out in the late 70s, but I would think that, you know, movies like Friday the 13th and even Nightmare on Elm Street wouldn't exist without Carpenter's Halloween. I don't think Carpenter's Halloween would exist without Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Now, one could argue this isn't technically a horror movie. It could also be seen as more of like a suspense, murder, thriller type thing. But, you know, it's a slasher movie. The killer is a slasher killer. And, you know, it's no spoiler the famous scene where the woman is killed in the shower with, you know, a butcher knife. The same kind of knife that Michael Myers uses in Halloween. And I sort of consider this, at least in my opinion, the first true slasher film. And it's a masterpiece, you know, in terms of atmosphere. It's very unsettling tone. It sort of builds up, you know, you feel really, I almost want to say uncomfortable through a lot of the movie, and then it reaches that famous point in the film where that murder happens, and it's only halfway through, which, movie was very innovative in that it killed off what everybody thought was the main hero. You know, the main heroine of the movie gets it halfway through the movie, you know, and it just blew everybody's mind at the time, because that had never been done before. I mean, you know, you don't kill off your main character. And that's not a spoiler. If anybody actually gets butthurt about that, well, too bad. This movie came out so long ago, and is probably the reason for many of people's aversion to taking showers, especially alone. It can be quite creepy. I want to say it was my great-uncle saw this in the theaters when it came out, and couldn't take a shower for a long time. I mean, you're so vulnerable in that state, and the idea of a killer coming in, and, you know, you got that classic music which has been done to death and parodied and spoofed, sometimes, actually, I think, makes people, I don't want to say it's underappreciated, because this is a really critically lauded movie, but I've met people who, when they think of Psycho, they're like, oh yeah, that movie with the shower, and the ee, and that's all they really attribute to it. The whole movie all the way through, from the way it's shot, directed, written, acted, it's a masterpiece. And if you haven't seen Psycho, it's a good one to check out. Absolutely. Really quick, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I was talking about my great-uncle. I think it was my great-uncle. I'm going to have to ask my mom. But going back to the Bela Lugosi Dracula, my grandmother saw that when she was a little girl, like maybe 5 years old or something like that, in the theater when it came out. Her parents told her she couldn't see it. She snuck out with her older sisters and saw it anyways. And even all the way up into old age, she could not watch this movie. Bela Lugosi just scared the hell out of her. And I love that story. I've heard it so many times, and I find it, you know, it's one of those stories that I never get tired of. Just how scared, paralyzed she was by Bela Lugosi. You know, those eyes of his, those intense eyes, I know really freaked her out. Which that's actually one of the things I love about Lugosi, was his intensity, even though it's, some people debate over this, but I don't think it's much of an argument to say that Boris Karloff was a more skilled actor. Now we're moving on to newer films again. This is one from 1979. It's one of my personal favorites. Is Don Coscarelli's Phantasm. This is a very surreal horror movie. This one is kind of like Evil Dead, a testament to what could be done on a very small budget, because, I mean, these were all unprofessional actors. I don't believe Coscarelli had made many movies, maybe only like one or two before this. I don't know for certain. I'm not a Coscarelli fanboy like I am with Sam Raimi, so I can't say for sure. And it's kind of hard to explain what Phantasm's really about without spoiling it. Needless to say, it's a good one. Angus Scrimm is the name of the actor who plays the horror villain known as the Tall Man. And the movie mainly takes place in and around this mortuary where the Tall Man, who is sort of this mysterious figure, and I don't even think they go into his backstory or who he is or how he came to be until sequels later, is harvesting bodies for nefarious purposes. I would definitely recommend it if you're into that sort of, late 70s gory B-movie thing. It's quite good for that. Moving on, if you want to talk about gore, then let's talk about Clive Barker's Hellraiser. Not for the faint of heart. This movie's not for everybody. In fact, one could say that all of these movies are not for everyone, depending on what you're looking for, whether it's, shock value or, atmosphere. But this one is about this guy named Frank, who finds this puzzle box, which turns out to summon these beings called Cenobites. They basically feed on human suffering, and in other words, they will tear your soul apart. So a lot of people know who Pinhead is. He's not really the lead Cenobite, even though everybody says he is, but he's one of those, I think, other iconic horror faces. He's not as well known as, Michael Myers, Jason, Freddy, but I would say that among horror fans, everybody knows who Pinhead is. Moving back into horror comedy, we have this modern classic, Shaun of the Dead. A total parody of the Romero era of zombie movies, but done with a very distinct British charm. I love British humor, and I love this movie so much. It's the first of what is known as the Cornetto trilogy, which all parody their own genre of films. But out of the three of them, Shaun of the Dead might be my favorite. The second one, Hot Fuzz, which is a parody of action cop films, is debatable. But Shaun of the Dead is an awesome, funny movie, and that would also be very high up on my list of my top favorite comedies. Not just horror comedies, just comedies. But it does a great job balancing the horror with the humor, and I like when they're able to maintain that balance in movies of this kind. Such as the next one here, which I'm still been trying to get my older brother to watch because I know he'd love it, but of course the big twist in it has now been, I think, spoiled for him, is Cabin in the Woods. This movie is one of those expectation-defying movies. The trailer made it look like a run-of-the-mill horror film where a bunch of teens go to a cabin in the woods, and they go there to do drugs, and they go there to get laid, and this is the same old story that we've all heard. It's a lot like Evil Dead in that way, too, and in fact, when my brother and I first saw the trailer, we were thinking, wait, is this the Evil Dead remake? Because it hadn't come out yet, but we knew they were working on it. But it's not. It's from Joss Whedon, and is everything you don't expect it to be from the trailer, which is brilliant. It is such a fun horror film, and it has elements of horror comedy too, very dark comedy, but there's plenty of comedy in there, and has quickly taken its place on, would be my top shelf of favorite horror movies of all time. It's really creative, really clever, really well done, just an all-around great movie, and like all of the others we've already gone through, I highly recommend this one too. Now, I'm going to do another one here. This isn't really a horror movie, it's more of an action-adventure movie, and this one is a lot for you viewers also who may not be into the more gruesome stuff or want something a little more action-packed. This is another movie that I think is underrated, although its negative reception that it does have is justifiable, but it's kind of like, in my Mummy review, it's a popcorn movie. From the same director. I mentioned this movie earlier, and this is Stephen Sommers' Van Helsing. Not really a horror movie, as I said. Really corny. This one, even more than The Mummy, is filled to the brim with CGI. Not all of it great either. But it is another sort of love letter to those Universal monster movies, specifically the later ones, the ones I call the Monster Mash movies. And if ever there was a modern day Monster Mash, it's Van Helsing. It has, you know, Dracula, the Frankenstein monster, the Wolfman, but very action heavy, but a lot of fun if you're into that sort of popcorn movies thing that I am. But it's just a lot of fun. That's all it is. It's not a masterpiece, but still I think underrated because, I mean, if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, for example, at some of those later Universal Monster Mash movies, like House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, where Universal was just trying to cram as many monsters into a movie as they could, not really caring about how plausible the story was, you know, ignoring the fact that monsters like those aren't plausible at all anyways. But the point is, they put them together for the sake of putting them together, because the more monsters equals more seats in the movie theater and more money. But at the same time, the Monster Mash has its own sort of charm, especially around this time of year if you want some good, more lighthearted, you know, fun. You know, they're not scary. This one might scare really little kids and stuff, but for the most part, it's just one big roller coaster ride. And for that, it's really cool. But it's definitely a product of its time, and I don't think is anywhere near as good as Stephen Sommers' remake of The Mummy. So, and that about wraps it up. There's one more thing I wanted to talk about, which is not a movie, but a TV series, and might be one of my favorite horror shows, just in general, whether you're talking movies or TV shows. And this is, it's on Showtime, and it just finished up its final season. The first season is still my favorite, probably, but that's a tough call, is Penny Dreadful. Penny Dreadful was a name for cheap, mass-produced horror stories. Like, they would cost like a penny in England during the Victorian era. Kind of like the pulp comics of the 50s. But what it does is it brings all of the classic Victorian-era horror stories together into one universe. So one could say it's almost a Monster Mash itself, but it's not done for, you know, it's not done for spectacle and thrills. It's a very dark, very mature, moody show. Masterfully written, really well acted, and might actually be my favorite depiction of Dr. Victor Frankenstein that's been done, as well as the monster. It's very, the Frankenstein monster in this, for example, is a very relatable, very human character. He has a lot of pathos, kind of like Boris Karloff's interpretation of the Frankenstein monster back before the monster was just a shambling, you know, machine of destruction, back when he actually had, you know, heart to him. But like I said, it's very dark, very mature, but very good. It brings the Wolfman in its own way into the story. It's got vampires. They never did do mummies, which they sort of hinted at they were going to do. And before I realized the final season was the final season, I thought that's what we were going to get in the next season was some stuff with Egyptian mummies, because they sort of hinted that they were going to take in that direction, or at least I thought they did. But anyways, I really recommend it. There's also an original character in this movie, Vanessa Ives, played by the gorgeous Ava Green, and she's a very haunted character. I don't want to go into too much detail, because then we're getting into spoiler territory, but her soul is in danger. But it brings all of those classic books into the fold. Bram Stoker's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's, or Percy Shelley's, depending on who you ask, Frankenstein. You've got, as I said, even The Wolfman, which wasn't a novel at all. It's got Dorian Gray from Oscar Wilde in there. It's just really cool, and they were brought together in a very serious way, as opposed to, like I said, a very spectacular monster mashy sort of way. Really cool show. I recommend it if you're into very dark, gothic, Victorian-esque horror. And that really wraps it up for now. I mean, there's tons of other horror movies I could talk about. There's some I could rattle off as honorable mentions, which I had said earlier I wasn't going to do when I was talking about doing this video to my wife. You know, I don't have John Carpenter's Halloween here, but it's definitely one of my favorites, and I need to get on that. I need to buy a copy of it really soon because I can't believe I don't own it. And in fact, it might be, depending on my mood, one I actually prefer, even over Nightmare on Elm Street, for the slasher films of the late 70s and 80s. But it's a tough call, really. The thing I like about Michael Myers is that you don't really know anything about him. He's just, you know, he was called The Shape in a lot of the credits. You know, he was just this force, you know, with the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. Which they kind of took away that mystique of Michael Myers in Rob Zombie's remake, although I do like Rob Zombie's remake, at least the first one, for its own reasons. But I'm not going to go into that because then we'll be talking here for a long time because there are things I like about it and things I don't like about it, etc., etc. Trying to think of some other honorable mentions. Fright Night is a great horror movie. It's kind of a love letter to the Hammer horror movies too, because you have this character, Peter Vincent, which is just combining two horror legends. Peter Cushing, who played Van Helsing in Horror of Dracula, Vincent Price, who was in tons of old horror movies, especially the Roger Corman ones. But he plays this sort of washed-up actor who acted in those old Hammer horror movies. And the main character is this teenage kid who's obsessed with these monster movies, kind of like I was as a teenager, actually. He finds out that his next-door neighbor is a real vampire, and he ends up having to recruit Peter Vincent, who was just an actor and is now sort of a late-night horror show host, into helping him defeat the vampire. And he's really reluctant at first, and it's a really great horror comedy because it's not a straight-up horror movie either. Like a lot of my favorite horror movies, it has a healthy dose of laughter in there too. So Fright Night's another good one I don't actually own a copy of. That I recommend. The remake wasn't bad either. It was very different, and I could go into my thoughts about the changes that they made in that one for a long time too, which I won't right now. Remake good, original better, in my opinion. Although if you're a David Tennant fan, you shouldn't miss the remake, because he's hilarious in that movie. Gosh, you know, I'm trying to think of some other ones, some other honorable mentions I could throw in there. There's just so many of them, though. So many great horror movies. Suspiria by Dario Argento is another great one. Its story's not the strongest, but what it lacks in that it makes up for in a sensory overload of amazing visuals, a great soundtrack, and a very spooky atmosphere. So there's that one. I mean, there's tons. But I hope this wasn't too boring for you guys. I recommend all of the movies I've shown for their own merits. If any of them interest you more, whether you've seen them or haven't seen them and want to hear more about them, I don't need an excuse to yammer on about these, especially right now, the Universal Monster films, because I've been in such a Universal Monster phase, which is something that comes and goes from time to time. So I love talking about all of this stuff. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the Facebook page yet and you're on Facebook, I would ask that you definitely check that out because there's a lot of updates on there. I had one person on YouTube ask me why I'm not active lately, and you know, they're wanting me to make more, and I do want to make more. I plan on making more, especially popcorn reviews. And the thing with those is they take a lot longer to make than one might think. Even ignoring all of the things in life that kind of get me distracted from making them, even when I'm fully focusing all of my time and energy on a popcorn review, it's a lot more work than you think. But Yeah, I have a post on there more or less answering why I haven't been active, which if you're not following me on Facebook you won't see, etc., etc. I'm still considering phasing out my blogger page because everything that I put on there just goes on the Facebook page anyways, and I mean, I don't even know who uses Blogger anymore, so a convenient place to find everything other than YouTube would be the Facebook page. So I think that's all for now. I want to get another KalaVlog done soon. I had a post on the Facebook page about, this is on another subject, this is sort of my epilogue here, sorry if this is too tangenty, but I did a post about the King's Quest novelizations, and I plan on doing a KalaVlog soon, more about those, as well as books based on the Myst series of games. So it's books inspired by computer games, or adapted from computer games. This is probably the next KalaVlog I'm going to do. As for what comes after that, we'll just have to wait and see, but I'm hoping the next Popcorn review will be out around Christmas time. But, so, you know, fingers crossed. We'll see. So, in the meantime, I hope you have an awesome Halloween, and enjoy yourself, be safe, and we'll see you again real soon, I hope.